Good morning and good afternoon. Welcome, welcome. I'm Morris Maduro. I'll be talking to you today about the 4 phases of habit change. This webinar is to introduce you to the content and the work that I've been doing. I call it the 7 Fitness Series, and that's what this is all built around. We'll talk about that as we go through. Now, what it's not mystical mumbo jumbo. It's not the law of attraction. While there are elements of things that you've heard in the past that are very much present here, but if you consider that way back into the New Thought era and before that, so 1850 to about 1940 or so, called the New Thought era, where a lot of philosophers were talking about the subconscious and how it all works, and law of attraction was created around 1890. William James was in that period of time, called the father of psychology. The book Think and Grow Rich was written in the 1920s. Magic of Believing, not too long after that. Psycho-Cybernetics. All these books were all saying and speaking to the same thing. The difference that exists today that they didn't have is that we have the brain scanning capability to see what's going on in the brain, to see what parts light up. And that has helped build some definition between what we're actually doing with thinking and what's actually happening with habit. And that's where this is coming from. So again, some of it will sound like something that you've heard before, but I want you to withhold judgment and just roll with it, sort of let the onion unpeel. And then if you want, at the end, we'll have some time for Q&A. I'm going to put in the chat the invitation, and then you can use that invitation to enter into the chat, because I'm streaming to different places. And for example, my streaming software doesn't allow messages from LinkedIn. Yeah, so you won't see it from LinkedIn, but from the others, you'll be able to. You may need to log into the webinar. If you want to log into the webinar, we'll get there at the end, because I'm not going to stop for Q&A until we get to the end, then I'll spend some time with it. All right, so we're talking about what it's not. And it is a taking charge of the subconscious. And when you consider that habit resides in the subconscious, it makes sense that we want to talk about the subconscious. Now, I'm going to say this because this here border at the top is not supposed to be there. It took me 15 minutes to get this software working. There's some bug somewhere. Anyway, that's what that's about. That should be gone. Now, why the 7 Fitness Series? I wanted a way to reset the conditioning. I knew that there was possibility, whether observing how the equivalent of placebos work. And remember, we think about placebos as in the prescription drug scope, or in that family. But a placebo is really anything that we can do with our thoughts, and a nocebo, and to benefit us. And a nocebo, the opposite, is something we can do with our thoughts that hurts us. So if you look at a placebo, and most people have had some experience where something that they visualized or believed came true, and they could connect it but couldn't quite connect it. And what really makes it difficult is that it doesn't happen reliably. It's not all the time. So I wanted something that would happen reliably and sustainably. I bring up placebo because placebos in some cases will work 50% of the time. And there are prescription drugs that are not that much better than placebos, but people take prescription drugs and believe in them, spend money on them. It's backed up by insurance and medical science. However, if you look at the percentage of time things like visualization, affirmations, goal setting, these things work, yes, it's not going to work 100% of the time, but it works often enough that I think it's in that zip code. Some placebos work, 30%. Some prescription drugs only work 30 or 40%. So the bar is actually not that high, but we put a high bar on there because I think when we rely on these practices, we're really relying on them, and then they don't come through, and then it's a lot of drama that goes with that. So this fascination took me through neurolinguistic programming, deep into law of attraction. I I looked at things from different perspectives, but one thing that was consistent, because I wasn't doing this for any specific thing other than to uncover. And so I would test. And fortunately, I had a long career in sales and then sales management and sales operations. So I had a great platform to test this, because in sales, the numbers don't lie. You can talk about all this stuff, but at the end of the day, are we putting sales on the board? I wanted to find something that you could reset your conditioning without hours of meditation, without relying on something that's in the woo-woo gap, fear of getting emotionally hijacked or knocked out of state, or believing with more emotion. What I mean by that is, too often people are nervous about rising too high too fast, because they spend so much time thinking about what happens if I fall. And so, and sometimes we know that just by getting knocked out of state, that could be that could lead to a fall. Some people rely so much on willpower, or so much on state management, and that becomes their thing. But at the end of the day, if it's not reliable, they can only go as fast as their trust will allow them. And this is what causes people, I think, to fall prey to some things. And that's what gets me to the 7 fitness series. So that's set up in a very specific order. You see, I have at the bottom, be, do, have. And it's shifting from a have, do, be paradigm to a be, do, have. If you consider having the relationships, professional, and financial on the left side, so moving from a have, do, be, when I have these things, then I'll be happy. You can see how people can fall into corruption, and they can fall into bad habits, and getting mixed in with the wrong crowd, because they're so focused on a financial reward or some relationship or some professional promise that they let go of what's really important. So the way I have it set up, mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional, those are in our control. The mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional, those are in our control. We dictate what happens with them and what we do with them. The right side, relationships, professional, and financial, is what we receive when we do the right things and avoid getting emotionally hijacked. So the mental, physical, spiritual, clearly in our domain. Then we have the emotional. I call it the gateway to the right side, because it can stop you and it can catapult you. We've all seen people emotionally hijacked, people getting triggered. I've heard of people quitting jobs in an instant just because something was said in a meeting and they just couldn't handle it, and they bolt out of the room, no plan, nothing, and they're gone. They quit, then and then they regret it. People do this with relationships. They can't take it anymore and they bolt out, and then they regret it. And anyway, you get the point. So emotional is both ways. And then, of course, the relationship, professional, financial, while those are not totally in control of other people, they are definitely impacted by other people. You can't decide that you're going to have a relationship with someone and it's a unilateral decision. See, some people try to force that. Obviously, it's not sustainable, it doesn't work, it's not ethical. So relationships and then professional, clearly other people are involved. You have a business, you still are relying on customers. And someone could argue, well, I'm a financial trader, so all I'm doing is trading. Yes, that's true, but every trade has two sides, a buyer and a seller. Now, you may not be interacting with them directly, but the point is the right side does involve you entering into the external environment, whereas the left side in the middle is all internally. So you could think about it that way. So we're going to start with the mental area, and it starts with the 4 pillars that we control, as I mentioned. We got mental, physical, spiritual, emotional. I will not be talking about relationship, professional, and financial today, but when you have the agency by making the shifts in these 4, then you can decide what you want. And in the workshop, what we do is we spend that last part of the time actually designing the on-ramp to your vision, because now you have the agency. You're past the fears and the concerns. And I like to think of it as fear and greed. That's what holds us back, right? We want to gain a benefit or avoid a loss. You take those to extreme, you have fear and greed, and that fear and greed keeps us from living our best life. So in the workshop, we do get into planning the relationship, professional and financial, but that's a a bigger project that I do more in the transformation work, but we do get there in the workshop. Each area has automatic resistance factors and empowerment catalysts. Empowerment catalysts are affirmations, visualization, meditation. Resistance factors, fixed mindset getting triggered. Cognitive biases could turn into resistance factors. Things like meta programs, and a meta program is sort of a bundle of associations. So we know we have stimulus response. You can have associations that get bundled together because you fire them so often, they're just like together, right? Like, you can come up with some examples that every time you do this, you want to do that. And that's just a loose example of a meta program. This is something that's happening in milliseconds because they fire them so often. They say neurons that fire together wire together. Now, so the 4 shifts in the mental area, we're going to make a shift: conscious versus the subconscious. You in today's webinar, you will learn to discern the difference between conscious thinking and subconscious impulse. So they are both energy. If you subscribe to, which I do, the quantum physics view versus Newtonian physics, then everything is atoms, and you understand that thought, at its most basic form, thought is energy. Well, so is the impulse running through the neurons. So when we get an impulse, that can feel and seem like thought, but it's not. It's associations, and this is very important. So we'll discern the difference between conscious and the subconscious, the messaging and the signals that are coming from there. And we have physical. We're going to rethink cognitive processing. So a lot of folks have a view of cognitive processing, but we haven't really thought about it a lot. And I think there's some reasons why it's confusing, and I'll get into some of that. Spiritual is interaction with the higher self. Now, this is not about spiritual in terms of religion or external or faith and those things, although I do believe in living by faith, and I think faith requires agency, right? Faith without works is dead. You have to have some agency to live by faith and to not give up. And so there is an amount of agency, and that's where it comes into play. But this spiritual is talking about interaction with your own higher self. That's why I say it's on this side. So if you think about it this way, we have the subconscious. Sub tells you where it belongs. That's at the bottom. We have the higher self. Higher tells you where it belongs. That's at the top. And then we have the conscious in the middle. So it's higher self, the conscious mind, and the subconscious. Too often what happens after 30 and gets locked in by 40, and then at 50 and 60, we don't think there's another way, is the subconscious goes here. And in fact, people think of the subconscious as the higher self, and the conscious is just along for the ride. We're going to flip that. The conscious mind can actually tell the higher self what it wants and where it wants to go. And the conscious mind can talk to can reset the programming of the subconscious so that it's doing its bidding. Now we have the automaticity, and we all experience the automaticity of the subconscious. Getting triggered is automaticity. Imagine getting triggered, but getting triggered to the right behaviors for your vision and your goals. And then we have emotional, and emotional is maintaining a growth mindset. Then it gets bigger than that, but we're going to look at all 4 of these as they relate to the stimulus response cycle. And that's what a lot of this has to do with. And some of you may have read Atomic Habits. There are other books out there that come really close to what I'll be talking about today, but I haven't found any that actually crossed the line. And I'll tell you what that line is that I'm going to cross today. Nothing scary, but it's a big distinction. And when you make that distinction, some people will get it right away. Other people will spend some time in cognitive dissonance because it's so confusing, and they're trying to reconcile it with what they used to know. It's almost like Galileo and Copernicus when they were saying that the Earth revolves around the sun, and they actually burned Bruno. Galileo one of them died. I think it was Copernicus died early, and then Galileo was forced to stop the teaching. But Bruno was actually the one who was burned at the stake. My point is, at that time they believed that the sun revolved around the Earth, and Copernicus was saying no, the Earth revolves around the sun. And the definition of astronomy was the study of how the sun revolves around the Earth. So you can see the disconnect there. Now, the 7 fitness areas. So what I did to look at this is I had to come up with something that you can get above the line and exist above the line and not have this up and down, up and down. You get up there, you're having a great day, and bam, you come crashing down. Too many people. This has happened to too many people. I've seen it in my life. I've seen it in others. And being in sales and sales operations, you see people and they get up there and then they're so worried about when the other shoe is going to drop. It's like, I'm still hanging on. You can hear it in their language. Sometimes you can hear it in athletes, and not so much anymore because there's so much social media. I think people are paying more attention to what they say. But you can hear somebody who's having they're on a streak, and the most of their conversation is about, I'm afraid of when it's going to end. Now, I talk about this living 95% by habit. You can see why this would feel like the Matrix. And the inflection point is the beginning of living above the line. Now, down in here, it's 95% by habit. Up here, I also think you're going to get to a place of 80, 85% by habit. I don't want to be much below that, because the subconscious is too fast to deal with life using just the conscious mind, but I want to be able to direct it. So it's still living by habit, but it's habits that we formed, and I'll talk later. You're forming those habits based on principles, whereas this 95% by habit for most of us was formed from age 0 to 7. Age 0 to 7, we were downloaded with this information, the model of the world. We didn't have to work for it. And it probably worked in an agricultural time, because from the difference between being 6 years old and being 26 years old wasn't that big of a difference. You were still farming. Today, even though the kids of today, or the Gen Z, they grew up with technology, they didn't grow up with AI the way we know it today. And just think about that. It's going to keep snowballing, this constant acceleration of capabilities that we have in the face. Now, the mental, I talked about fast and slow thinking. This is the beginning of starting to see the distinction between the conscious mind and the subconscious. Conscious mind is thinking, processes at only 50 bits per second. I mentioned that it was slow. There it is. Reaction time of about a half second, 500 milliseconds for the conscious mind. 50 bits per second is slow. Now, subconscious is associations. It's processing at 11 million bits per second. Just think about that for a moment. So when you see somebody getting triggered, or when you have these survival reactions, if you ever see somebody about to have an accident, very often it's the same exact position, straight arm slamming on the brakes. And whereas there's actually evasion maneuvers that people can be thinking about if they do some implementation intentions. Not always, obviously, but my point is survival reactions are often not what we need, but that's what happens. If you've ever had, and I can't prove this, but if you've ever fallen off of something and you've had it's like your life flashes before your eyes. My view of that is that's the subconscious looking for, what can I do to save myself from this imminent danger? And you see how fast it flashes before your eyes. That's just giving you a sense of how that 11 million bits per second, you have access to it. And that's what I wanted to do with 7 Fitness Series, is find a way for people to have access to that on purpose, intentionally, and reliably. The reaction time of the subconscious is about a quarter of a second. So 250 milliseconds is 2.5 of a second. Put it in perspective, cats have about a reaction time of somewhere around 50 to 80 milliseconds. That's why they're so quick. The snake moves and the cat's gone, right? Dogs have a reaction time of about 150 milliseconds. And then athletes and like Formula One drivers, where they do those constant exercises, they're constantly working on their stimulus response, they can get down to the 150 milliseconds. So they can get their reaction time down to that of like dogs. So you look at boxers and things like that, they're going to be in that 150 range as well. So this is the beginning. Conscious thinking is thinking. Subconscious is not thinking. It's associations. This is running through the neurons. This is impulses running through the neurons, and associations by definition are from the past. Habits are from the past. Where'd you get the habit? Now, there are some associations that I can make by visualizing, and I can create future outcomes, not manifesting them, but I can create by using implementation intentions. I can say, when the player moves to this spot, I'm going to train myself to automatically move here. or here, whatever it is. You can train yourself that way with implementation intentions, and you can visualize it. And then when that thing happens, you've done it, but it's still an association. It's an association that you've drilled. Without that association, you're going to go what the subconscious comes up with, which is probably a survival reaction, depending on the situation. So here's what we're looking at. In mental, fast and slow thinking, fast is the subconscious, slow, and it's not thinking, it's the associations. Slow is the conscious mind. And when we look at stimulus response, people think of this as the stimulus response cycle. This whole thing can be a half a second. Now, over here, you see I have the reaction equals the response. That's how it is in the traditional way of thinking about stimulus response. And this is the beginning of where we're going to start breaking it apart. So that response, you decide, you act, you speak, fight or flight, freeze or faint or withdraw. That person I talked about who ran out of the room just, because they were so annoyed. I've seen it with public speakers. Somebody getting ready to speak and they lose their place and they just bolt. It's like you see fight or flight happening right before you. Well, this reaction should not equal the response. This is the first starting to pull it apart. That reaction, if you accept that habits are from the past and habits are associations, it's not thinking. If you accept that, and you accept that associations are from the past and the past is different from the future or from the present, back to the agricultural versus the technology age, then you would probably agree that those associations are probably not the right response for any given situation. So therefore, we should not let the reaction equal the response. We need to put a pause between there. But that decide, act, speak, fight or flight, freeze or faint, and then after doing that, because people didn't differentiate between their conscious thought versus their subconscious impulse, they then think that that was them who said it. So they said X, Y, Z. But as I look at it, they didn't say X, Y, Z. Their associations got them to say X, Y, Z. And if they could see that it was their associations, they could also see that, oh, I should be pausing, letting that become a data point, and then thinking consciously about what I really want. The beauty of that, it can all be done in less than a second. It doesn't take long because the subconscious is so fast at getting us information. We could provide a data point or a perspective or ask a question of it and get a ton of great information, and you get it instantaneously. Because thought is energy, it happens very, very quickly. You can literally, in most situations, get it done in less than a second. We're going to break it down some more. So here we go. Fast and slow thinking. And so when you see this, remember, slow thinking is the subconscious impulses. And I'm going to talk about that more in the physical area. A pause of 1 second makes a difference. In addition to stimulus response, we put reaction in there. So reaction is that 250 milliseconds. But then the conscious mind kicks in another 250 milliseconds after that. But the subconscious is already off and running. The model, the idea is already been figured out. They've been triggered. And so it's very difficult to rein all that back in. So we're going to add a pause in here. But the other problem we have is this pre-stimulus. Now, if you look down here, these are the things that could impact pre-stimulus. Priming. Priming is powerful, very powerful. I don't have time to go into it today, but if you read a book like Persuasion by Robert Cialdini, in fact, his book Influence talked about priming. He talked about it more from cognitive biases, but they sort of go together. Priming is getting you ready to make a certain kind of decision, to have a bias towards a certain kind of decision. And the cognitive biases is what it plays on. Artificial intelligence, not because it knows something, but because it's being programmed. It's been programmed and it's doing its learning from all the information that's out there in the world. That information that's out there in the world, especially marketing and advertising, has gone down a path of leveraging cognitive biases. And so all of this, the priming and the cognitive biases, the social influence, the environment, some culture stuff, attention, a lot of this is going to be recreated, and it already is in artificial intelligence. I could give artificial intelligence chat GPT. I'll say, just give me a pastor framework. I want this marketing done in a pastor framework, and it'll give it to me. I'll give it a narrative, a paragraph. I say, put this into a pastor framework, and it's done. So it knows what to do because it's looked at how words have been put together, and it takes the most common way of words being put together, and that's what it gives you back. I may not be saying that exactly right, but that's essentially the layman's version of that. Now, on the finishing up on the mental area, I will throw this out there. I'm not going to spend time on it. This is a big deal. I'm working on dynamic leadership because the next thing was to take what I know from 7 fitness areas, which is the individual, but habits are to the individual as culture is to the organization. So I want to be able to apply this to the organization. Uh, Self-determination theory says that there's 3 pillars that people that represent the needs that people have for intrinsic motivation. And those pillars are autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And you can see these playing out through everything that we do. Now, there's another thing, 6 human needs: significance and connection and variety and certainty, and then growth and contribution. And the short version on that is growth and contribution. When you go after those two, the 2 higher of the 6 needs, the other 4 can get met. This is a little bit different. This is about intrinsic motivation, and intrinsic motivation means I like doing the task itself. I get joy from doing the activity, as opposed to incentives or something else. That's why it's important with dynamic leadership. It's worth looking into self-determination theory. Physical. So here's the deal: 100 billion neurons in the brain and nervous system together. It's 86 billion in the brain, and then another 14 billion or so in the nervous system. And in that is also the mirror neurons, which is how we have empathy for other people. Mirror neurons are really interesting because if I'm speaking to someone and they raise their arm or they scratch their face, the area of their brain that lights up for them to scratch their face also lights up in my brain. It's very fascinating. And this is where we get some of these, I was just thinking about you, or yeah, I had that same thought, or people yawning. So those are the mirror neurons. Impulses through the neurons are similar to thoughts. That's what I was saying before. The neurons are physiological, neurobiological, right? If a person dies, their mind is, I don't know where to go, the spirit, the soul, where to go. But the neurons in the brain are still there. So while the impulses going through the neurons is energy, the neurons themselves are matter, which makes them physical, which is why I have it in the physical area. And when you start thinking about the 11 million bits per second and how fast it is, it's fast because you have energy coursing through these neurons. As 100 billion neurons are a lot. This is why you get that grouping. I mentioned meta programs, that the associations that fire quite often, you get this grouping of them, and those are called meta programs. Slow thinking is the conscious mind working. Now, I want to say something because there are people who've been trying to define consciousness. People have tried to define the mind, and both of them, I would still say, are undefinable when you look at the lack of consistency across those definitions. People will say the mind is the brain at work. I would 100% disagree with that. The mind is the mind, and the brain is the brain, and the brain is the neurons and the impulses and managing that nervous system. But the mind regulates all of that energy. That's what the mind does. It regulates so it may make the brain work, and it may make the brain do things, but I want to make sure we're keeping the mind up here, and the brain is subservient to the mind, because the brain is where all those neurons are, 100 billion neurons. If you look at what the subconscious does and you look at what neurons do, it's the same. That's how that's why this conclusion exists. So the objective is to, 1, learn the difference. I've already talked about that by speed, and then after a while, you'll start to pick it up because it's repeated. See, a conscious thought is going to be new. Or an association is something you've seen before, it's happened before. So repeated thoughts, all those things, you can start to get rid of them, the ones that don't serve you. Now, I talked about the physical area. Let's take a look at this. Most of these areas, I didn't talk about that. So if I look at priming and I look at So not maybe not cognitive biases, but priming, that's in the nervous system. It's physiological. Social influence, well, interacting with other people is a physical component there. We're taking information in through our senses, our comfort level, our environment, that's physical. Culture is, we're interacting with other people. Where I put my attention, I can control it. That's a physiological thing. I control it with my mind, but if I'm looking here or looking there, that's where my attention is. And I can choose what I want to focus on by directing my eyes. So there's a physiological component. Obviously, mood is physiological, and anxiety and stress is physiological. So a lot of this pre-stimulus is happening in the physiological area, and we try to fix it all through the mind. We talk about cognitive processing. When you look at how much cognitive processing is actually coming in, is actually physiological, it starts to shift how you look at all of this. And we have reframing. Two types of reframes: contextual reframe and a meaning reframe. So in the contextual reframe, you're changing the context for the behavior. In the meaning reframe, you change the meaning, the behavior of the incident. Let's see, we're going to skip past. Let me just jump to now the cognitive processing. So if we were talking about reframing, that's reframing something that the mind can do. And by the mind reframing it, it changes how the subconscious is working. So by reframing something, my associations trigger in a different way, or I set off another set of associations. So that 1 second pause, first we have the pre-stimulus. You want to manage that. Then we have the stimulus reaction response. This is where the 1 second pause comes in. So we have a quarter of a second from here to here, and we have about another quarter of a second from here to here, because from here to here is about a half second. So half of that time is in the reaction. And this is why I said, if you just pause for another quarter of a second, so now we're 3/4 in, right? We're 750 milliseconds. And then you can start formulating a response. Now, if I'm in operational mode, I could go faster, because operational mode is the same stuff. I've seen it before. I have thin slicing helping me. In the project mode, this is another reason why I think projects are difficult for some organizations. In the project mode, the more I rely on fast thinking, the harder it's going to be to do a project, because I'm actually working on an area that I'm not familiar with. I haven't done it before. And so in that case, I may want to push things off, and then you have a regular meeting where you can talk about the pop outs, et cetera. But still, we're talking minutes, not hours, in terms of coming up with a response, because the subconscious is so fast and the conscious mind can rely on that information. Now, to neutralize adverse pre-stimulus, I would say physically shift your attention. Literally, pay attention to something. Use your mind to shift your attention, and you'll limit the effects of priming. You'll limit the effects of cognitive biases. I actually did a study, and there were like over 36 cognitive biases that were impacting success. I said that was a non-starter. Who's going to learn all of that? But there was a constant theme throughout all of the managing, or the managing of the cognitive bias, the limiting it, or limiting the impact, and it was all about mindfulness. And that's what led to the pause, because in order to, if you're being triggered, it's very difficult to get mindful, to go from triggered to mindful. But you can go from triggered to pause and neutral, and then mindfulness. And we've all been there. So learning to pause becomes a habit, that whenever you have associations going in a direction that you don't want, you can always pause. And that's the pattern interrupt. I look at the neurons like mob behavior. There's a lot of examples. Things are so fractal. There's a lot of examples that we can get from nature and that tell us how things operate. But when you look at mob mentality, that's how the neurons are. They start small, and these guys tell each other, and then these guys, and next thing you know, you have a big mob that you're trying to manage. And we've seen mobs get out of control. And that's what happens when you go into an anxiety spiral. The neurons, that's how I say it, the neurons is firing. This is not about mental health. So I'm talking about reaching your goals and developing, living into your vision, designing a life that you'll love living, and then living that life. This is not about mental health. And the last one is spiritual, of the four. Awareness by your higher self. So because consciousness is something that's difficult to understand, I talk about it as awareness of awareness, because everybody can get there. You're aware that you're listening to my voice and you're aware that I'm talking about awareness while you're aware of it. And then we could say you're aware that you're aware that you're aware. So you can keep going down this path of awareness and you can see the higher self. Now, here's where it comes into play. We've all been in the situation where we're doing something that we've said we're not going to do, and we're aware that we're doing it. Maybe you're scrolling on social media. You said you're not going to scroll on social media past 7 o'clock, and now you're still scrolling. And you're aware that you're still scrolling, and you're aware that you said that you weren't going to do it, and you're aware that you're still doing it. This, when you start to separate the subconscious from the conscious, that awareness starts to play a real big role, because then you can also take your higher self and say, is this something that I'm consciously choosing to do, or am I just acting out of habit? Is this a habit I want to continue feeding and allowing and reinforcing, or do I want to break that habit now? And because you recognize it as a physical habit, you recognize also that all you have to do is get up and go take a walk, and you're going to stop scrolling. It's a lot easier to get up and take a walk than it is to get yourself to stop scrolling. So put the phone down. And one of the things you can always do is, hey, because now you got this mob mentality with the neurons firing and wiring, right? No, we want to scroll, we want to scroll. Hey, look, we're going to take a quick walk. If we still want to scroll when we come back, we can scroll. Literally talking to your subconscious like it's a kid is actually a part of it. And I'm going to talk about that when I get to the MacGyver method, because this is something that works. And there's a book on it. I think it's called the MacGyver method. All right, so the spiritual collapse, the woo-woo gap through understanding. And the woo gap is what I say is when people say the universe and I manifested it. Well, how'd you manifest it? Oh, I don't really know, but you have to do this and energy happens and it's parallel universes and all this, stuff comes out trying to explain it. That's woo gap. What I wanted to do is collapse that. That was one of my tenets when I was looking at the 7 Fitness Series, collapse that woo gap to where it's virtually just the higher self. Sure, we've got the big spiritual realm over there. Hold on a second. It's realized I have not been on camera. So we have the big spiritual realm over there, and then we have the physical realm, and then we have this area that's in between, which is woo-woo, and I want to get that down to just the higher self. And infinite possibilities. When you're working above the line, you saw that drawing I had, that was the infinite possibilities, and then using a higher self to retrain the subconscious and put the automaticity to work for us. And this is the typical stimulus response. I'm going to talk now about setting up the stage for what we do in the spiritual and then going into emotional. Retrain the subconscious to scan for the positive. So I would say that generally speaking, the negative scan is about 70-30. The subconscious is looking at everything, and 70-30 is going negative. Now, when we get stressed out, it could be 80-20, it could be 90-100, where everything is a risk, everything is a threat. And what we want to do is flip it. We want to get it positive, scanning for the positive 70% of the time at least, even 80% of the time. If it's scanning for the positive, then those neutral things have less of a chance of becoming or being perceived as a threat. And there's resistance factors. So what I did when I looked at the 7 Fitness Series, I came up with resistance factors that exist in each of those areas. And those resistance factors, then I would have empowerment catalysts that I use. So if I'm working with a client, I'm actually paying attention to what are some of the resistance factors. And then it's a triage effect. A person, if they're being triggered all the time, you can't really talk to them about meditating if they're constantly being triggered. We first have to slow down that triggering and then change that. And that would be an example of the pause would be an empowerment catalyst in that case. But a pause is not going to be so useful for somebody who's already doing that. If they're not being triggered, if they're 100% in charge of their stimulus response cycle, I don't need to be talking to them about a pause. Now it's about exercising their agency and staying in that growth mindset, for example. So you can take a screenshot of that. Those are just some empowerment catalysts that are common for, they work. That's a good starting place. I have dozens of them now. Now, this is the positivity. We're doing a subconscious with the positivity drill, and we'll end with this one, a positivity drill. So if you have something that's negative, like a flat tire, that's seen as a negative experience. And that negative experience creates bad feeling. And this is the subconscious. The subconscious is scanning, and then even neutral things get to look like a negative experience. Now, in that case, what we want to do is retrain the subconscious that as soon as it sees the threat, to look at the positive context to see, is it really a threat? So it's a check on itself. Is this really a threat, or is it just part of a bigger positive context, right? So, if you look at a, a person and there's a dog, and that dog, and they may be first nervous about that dog, the bigger positive context is that, the dog is friendly, the human that's with the dog is saying is friendly, and the dog is in control, so it's no longer a threat. That's not the best example, but you saw this one with the flat tires and negative experience. But you know what? I wouldn't have a flat tire if I didn't have a car. So I'm literally teaching the subconscious to quickly flip. Now, this is not positive mental attitude. It's different. It's not reframing. It's different. It's not willpower. It's not suppression. I'll explain that in a moment. So what the positivity conditioning is this. This is literally something you're going to do 3 times a day for three times. You're going to do 3 incidents 3 times a day, and do it for about six weeks. And that is enough time. This is like deep practice. It's enough time that you will retrain your subconscious. So it's not that it's scanning for the positive as much as it's checking itself, all in that 250 milliseconds, all in that little space. So step 1, this is the exercise you'll do 3 times a day. Think of a bad experience that you've had in the past. Step 2, quickly switch to the larger positive context. Step 3, you see how I have it fading in there? Let the bad experience fade into the presence of the larger positive context. So you can kind of bask in that, but we're talking 3 minutes. You're going to do 3 incidents in a 3-minute period. So you got boom, boom. It happens pretty quick. Come up, and so at the end of 6 months, you'll have almost 100 of these experiences that you've thought of, and you very quickly. So it's not about changing that experience. It's about teaching the subconscious. So we want to do speed. You think of the bad experience, boom, you flip it over to the more positive one, and you spend time there. It's boom, because you're training your subconscious to do that on its own. So there's the conditioning drill. You can go ahead and screenshot that. As I mentioned, 3 times a day. You can do it with meals. That's what I did. And so it's this: into the pleasurable greater context, appreciating how fortunate you are to have blank. And the reason I said, excuse me, the reason I said it's not positive thinking, this is not about, oh, I'm happy. You see that we're literally training the subconscious. I said it's not reframing. It's not changing it. I have a flat. Oh, but at least I have enough time to get there. I have a flat. It's a good thing I gave myself enough time to get there. It's not reframing. It's not willpower. I'm going to make myself not focus on the negative. It's not that, and it's not suppression. Suppression is bad, which I'll talk about here. So this is what it looks like. This is that stimulus response cycle. Now we put this heart. This is that positivity. We've actually entered that into this 250 milliseconds. So now you have a stimulus and you have that reaction, but in between there, the subconscious is checking itself. Why put that burden on you? When you do this, that will reduce 80% of your triggering, potentially, depending on how often you get triggered. And then we have the assessment that you're making. Now you got a half a second, and we'll still be within 3/4 of a second. You make the assessment, and then you make a choice, and then you have a resourceful response. Now, we finished the spiritual, and now we're getting into the emotional. I call this the gateway to the right side. Emotional modulation, surf, don't suppress. When you suppress emotions, you turn them into a feeling, which becomes neurobiological or chemical reaction. It's in your nervous system now, and it can be called up as an association, or as a feeling, or a response or reaction. In her book, Joan Rosenberg talks about all negative emotions can be distilled to these 8: sadness, shame, helplessness, anger, embarrassment, disappointment, frustration, and vulnerability. And the reason why to reduce them to that 8 is because we want to label it. If you just have all the negative things that happen all feel like anxiety, then you're constantly firing off. You know how many neurons of the 100 billion are probably connected in some way to anxiety? And then when you add on the fact that anxiety and excitement have a similar signature, now you're getting anxiety over things you should be excited about. So by labeling it, you knock out a whole ton of imagined things that are not really there. And you also put it in perspective. You know, if it's something that's anger, and you're thinking it's anger, but you realize it's really just helplessness. Oh, well, wait a minute. That's a choice. You don't have to choose to be timid. You can actually step up. You can be assertive. If it's shame, you can put it in the greater context. By labeling it, you're empowering yourself. So that's, and the reason I have surfing the emotion is because in her book also, Joan Rosenberg says that emotions were never meant to be harbored or dwelled upon. They pass through 90 seconds. Now it's like cresting that wave, because if you right now, if you think about a bad experience, don't go too deep, right? Not too bad, but just a relatively bad experience, you might feel that emotion. Instead of suppressing it, which is the tendency, let it flow. Just let it flow through, and you're going to feel it coming up, and then you cresting that wave. And in the process of cresting the wave, what you want to do is you want to acknowledge it. So that's the locating it. Where's this emotion? You're going to label it. What is it? Which one of these 8 is it? Disappointment? Oh, okay. And then what did I learn from it? You know, like I was using the example of helplessness, you can learn maybe to be more assertive. So we're going to put that here. So now we have the positivity here, and that's going to change the reaction. So it's more positive. And then we have the potential for hijacking, because sometimes things will still get through. You can still get hit with something. There's always somebody trying to take something that's not theirs, right? Using that as a kind of euphemism. So there's always that potential for hijacking. And when you do get hijacked, you want to have a way to get back there. And that's the surfing. So locate the emotion, label it with one of these 8, and then learn from the emotion and allow that. And that's that surfing. As you're getting triggered, you want to just surf that to get through it. Now, this is the picture I showed you before. Infinite possibilities are up here. This was like the line, the matrix. So if you look at it like this, it's like this here. You're in between an upper and a lower limit. And then we try to go across the line, and we keep running into this barrier. This is why people from 30 to 50 can live a life of just quiet desperation. It's just the same thing over and over and over, because they keep getting up here and they get knocked back. They don't realize that it's actually, if you get through there, it's clean sailing up above. But this barrier can take 3 to 6 months, because there's all associations and there's feelings, there's stories, even good experiences I have in here. Good experiences, because it turns into I don't want power. You had something that worked so well, you don't want to do anything else. And when you're up here, you won't have the habits. So down here, we had the habits helping us. Up here, we don't. It's the unfamiliar and the unknown. And this is another reason why it's hard to cross that barrier, because we get this cognitive dissonance. It's like we're pushing against the belief that, we believed that we can never do it, and now here we are doing it. And so that's where that cognitive dissonance comes from. That's another thing that pushes people back down. And then what we're going to do is, because you don't have the habits, we're going to adopt best practices and principles, and those best practices and principles enable you to live a life, and those become your guiding principles, so to speak. So now you can operate with strength and consistency no matter what the VUCA is around you. You can ignore opportunities and you can ignore threats. They just don't apply to you, because you're on a vision and you know where you're going. And then this is that artificial barrier that I was talking about. And we get it through it, and then we have operational pivot, operational pivot, operational pivot, and you're using your best practices and your principles to stay on track. So here we are. Yeah, so there you go, projects and pivots. So the 7 fitness areas, those were the shifts. Conscious versus subconscious, you can understand which one is talking to you, because one is thinking and one is associations. Associations are from the past, and they should really be no more than a data point if you're living into the future and you have plans moving forward, because probably the life you're living is probably not the one that you were prepared for when you were 0 to 7. Physical, rethink, cognitive processing. Hopefully I've made the case that a majority of our cognitive processing is actually physiological. So stop thinking it's mental. And one of the things you can do is to start differentiating between me doing it versus my associations or my habits. And then you have the spiritual interaction with the higher self. And I talked about the MacGyver method. The MacGyver method is literally just talking to your subconscious and saying, he's the guy who wrote the TV series MacGyver, who always came up with some kind of a cool plan out of some gadgets. The idea of the MacGyver method, he would talk to his subconscious to say, I need a solution for X, Y, and Z, and I want it by 7 o'clock. And then he would go out and do something else, run, spend time with his family, shop, whatever. And then he'd come back and the subconscious would have it, because all of that, just like the life flashing before your eyes, when you give your subconscious a project like that, it's going to come up with this, almost like doing prompts in AI. And just like AI, if you ask it a question, it's going to have an answer. If you ask your subconscious a question, it's going to have an answer. So you want to formulate those questions properly, but you could literally have it design your strategies in a way that's just right for you. And that's powerful. When you start seeing this design happen and it's just right for you, it makes sense. It's like, whoa, you can never do that with the conscious mind because it's too slow. I say never. The conscious mind is very slow, so it would be more difficult. And then the emotional, maintaining a growth mindset. And there's two parts of there. One is the positivity exercise, which I have more in the physical area, because we're guiding ourselves, we're training the subconscious. And then I have the emotional modulation. So if you still get triggered, you have that. So there's a lot of tools there that you can use. And here's the workshop. We'll be doing a workshop in a couple of days, same time as this. It'll be 3 hours. We'll get into exercises. I'll spend more time. There's more slides here, about another 30 slides to get into more detail on some of the things, but we actually apply some of the practices. And I mentioned that if you go to this link, neuroplasticsolutions.com/workshop, as you exit that page, if you go to the link and then just go up and try to exit to another tab, you're going to get a drop down. In that drop down, you can register for this webinar right now that just finished, and it will take you to that place where you can then look at the link and click that link. I'll put it there again, and you'll be able to get yourself invited onto the stage, and we can have a conversation. All right. So I'm going to leave that stream up, but I'm going to take it off of some of these other areas.